loved his family and loved serving this state and our country. He dedicated his life to our country.
For nearly a quarter century in Washington, one man sat on the Senate Judiciary Committee, chaired the Budget Committee, negotiated with presidents, and traveled to war zones, all while carrying a personal distinction that followed him into every headline written about him. Lindsey Graham never married. He never had children. He never brought a spouse to a state dinner or a fiancée to a campaign stop. For years, reporters asked about it, comedians joked about it, and voters wondered about it. Graham himself usually laughed the question off, but the real answer was never really a mystery to the people who knew him best. It was written into the story of a boy who lost both of his parents before he'd finished college, and who chose, without hesitation, to raise his little sister instead of walking away. This is that story, told through the life Lindsey Graham actually lived, and through what his sister, Darline Graham Nordon, has said publicly over the years about the brother who became her guardian. Lindsey Olin Graham was born on July 9, 1955, in central South Carolina, a small mill town in the northwestern part of the state. His parents, Florence James Graham and Millie Graham, ran a combination restaurant, bar, pool hall, and liquor store that locals simply called the Sanitary Cafe. It wasn't glamorous. The family lived in rooms behind the business for years before eventually moving next door once things stabilized financially. Graham grew up working alongside his parents in that pool hall, absorbing the rhythms of a working-class southern town long before anyone could have imagined him negotiating immigration policy on the floor of the United States Senate. He was the first person in his family to go to college, enrolling at the University of South Carolina with plans that had nothing to do with national politics. Those plans were upended in the most painful way imaginable. In 1976, when Graham was around 20 years old, his mother died of Hodgkin's lymphoma. 15 months later, his father died suddenly of a heart attack. In the space of little more than a year, Graham had lost both parents, and he still had a much younger sister, Darline, to think about. She was still a young teenager, not yet old enough to be on her own, and there was no family fortune or extended support system waiting to absorb the loss. That single stretch of loss, more than any bill he later sponsored or committee he later chaired, shaped the rest of Graham's life. Friends who knew him during that period have said the deaths forced him to grow up almost overnight, swapping the ordinary concerns of a college student for something closer to the responsibilities of a parent. He finished his undergraduate degree and then went on to law school at the same university, all while functioning as the only adult his sister had left. There was no pause to grieve before figuring out what came next. The family business still needed sorting out, his sister still needed to be in school, and Graham still needed to finish a degree that would eventually let him support them both. People who watched him during that period have described a young man who simply did what needed doing, without much outward drama about it, because the alternative, letting his sister be split off among relatives or into some other arrangement entirely, was never something he seriously entertained. It's worth pausing on just how unusual that decision was for someone his age. Most 20-year-olds are, at most, worrying about their own coursework and their own social lives. Graham instead became responsible for making sure a young teenager had stability, structure, and someone showing up for her after watching both of her parents die within roughly a year of each other. He did this while still an undergraduate, then while attending law school, and then while beginning a demanding legal career in uniform. Few politicians who later built reputations as tough, battle-tested Washington operators can point to a formative period quite like it. Rather than send Darline to live with more distant relatives, Graham made the decision to keep her with him. After he enrolled in the Air Force Judge Advocate General's Corps and began active duty in the early 1980s, he took the additional step of legally adopting his sister so she would be covered under his military health and family benefits. According to reporting from NPR at the time of his death, Graham pursued that adoption specifically so Darline could be cared for through his own service benefits, a practical decision, but one loaded with meaning. He was effectively telling her, in the most concrete legal terms available to him, that he intended to be responsible for her from that point forward. It was not a symbolic gesture, Graham was balancing a demanding legal career in uniform with the day-to-day realities of raising a girl who had just lost both of her parents' schoolwork, emotional support, the ordinary logistics of a teenager's life, all while he was still building the foundation of what would become a 33-year military legal career. During part of his active duty service, he was stationed overseas in Europe, which meant managing his sister's upbringing from a distance and leaning on family friends back in Central to help fill the gaps. That kind of arrangement, unusual for a man not yet 30, left very little space in his life for the ordinary business of dating and courtship that most people his age were pursuing. Managing that responsibility from overseas was not simple. Part of his active duty service placed him at a base in Germany, thousands of miles from South Carolina, working as a military attorney while his sister continued growing up back home. That distance meant leaning on a small circle of trusted friends and family acquaintances in Central to check in on her, help with the day-to-day logistics of school and home life, and generally make sure nothing slipped through the cracks while Graham was fulfilling his military obligations abroad. He made a habit of returning home on leave whenever he could to check on her progress, a routine that friends of the family later pointed to as evidence of just how seriously he treated the arrangement, not as a box to check, but as an ongoing responsibility he refused to outsource entirely, even from another continent. The bond forged in those years never faded. Decades later, when Graham launched his 2015 campaign for the presidency, he did so in central South Carolina, the same small town where he'd grown up, and Darline stood beside him. He hugged her on stage as he announced his run, a moment captured by news photographers and later described by outlets covering his life as one of the clearest illustrations of how central she remained to his identity, long after either of them had left that childhood behind. Photographs from that campaign season show the two of them together again and again, riding a golf cart to a television interview at the Iowa State Fair, appearing side by side at press events, Darline occasionally stepping up to introduce her brother to a crowd of voters who had no idea, until they heard her speak, just how much of his personal story ran through her. For years, the closest thing to an official explanation for why Graham never married came from Darline Graham Nordorn herself, and it wasn't a secret revealed only after his death. She'd been saying versions of it publicly since at least his 2015 presidential run. Speaking with the New York Times during that campaign, she described her brother as a young man who took on the responsibility of raising a girl and then a teenager, all while trying to finish his own education. In her telling, there was no dramatic single decision, no turning point where he chose duty over romance. It was simply the shape his life took, once his parents were gone: school, the Air Force, and her. She has also spoken about the emotional weight of those years without softening it. In interviews given around the time of his death, she recalled how hard it was to lose both parents so close together, and how her brother assured her early on that he intended to take care of her, a promise she has said he simply kept year after year without ever treating it as some kind of sacrifice he was owed credit for. People close to the family, including longtime political consultant Bob McAllister, have echoed that sentiment, describing how the hardship the siblings shared as children left an imprint on Graham that shaped nearly everything he did afterward, from his work ethic to his devotion to South Carolina. It's worth noting that Graham never pretended the choice not to marry was purely about duty and nothing else. In his own 2015 memoir, he wrote candidly that he attributed his bachelorhood partly to timing, that the right opportunity, or the right person, simply never lined up at the right moment. He even revealed that he came close to proposing once, while stationed in Europe with the Air Force, to a woman he was dating at the time, but that it never happened. So the full picture that emerges from Graham's own words and his sister's is less a story of total renunciation and more one of a man whose priorities, formed in tragedy, quietly crowded out the space that dating and marriage might otherwise have occupied. Raising Darline came first, and by the time she was grown and settled, the habits of a life built around service, military, then legal, then political, had simply taken over. With his sister raised and his active duty service behind him, Graham moved into elected politics. He worked first as a legal officer and later as a local government attorney in his home county, before winning a seat in the South Carolina House of Representatives in 1992. 2 years later, he won election to the U.S. House of Representatives. In 2002, he moved to the United States Senate, succeeding the long-serving Strom Thurmond, and went on to win re-election multiple times over the following 2 decades. Throughout that period, he also continued serving in the Air Force Reserve, ultimately retiring as a colonel in 2015 after 33 years of total military service. By the time he reached the Senate, Graham had already spent more than 2 decades juggling 3 demanding roles at once: elected official, military reservist, and, in a quieter but no less real sense, the guardian who had raised his sister into adulthood. Colleagues in Columbia and later in Washington often remarked that Graham approached legislative work with the same restless, hands-on energy he'd needed as a young man managing a household on his own. He wasn't a lawmaker content to vote from the sidelines. He tended to insert himself directly into negotiations, often working across party lines in a way that occasionally frustrated members of his own party, but rarely left anyone doubting his willingness to engage. Much of Graham's early national reputation was built on his close friendship with Senator John McCain of Arizona. Along with Senator Joe Lieberman, the two were sometimes referred to around the Capitol as a tight-knit trio known for their work on defense and foreign policy issues that crossed party lines. McCain used to joke publicly that he'd watched Graham date plenty of women over the years, but had never once seen him get close to actually marrying one of them, a running bit between the two friends that reporters brought up so often. It became part of Graham's public persona. When McCain was diagnosed with brain cancer in 2017, it was Graham who personally relayed the news to fellow senators after speaking with him directly. Their friendship lasted until McCain's death in 2018, and Graham remained close to the McCain family for years afterward, a relationship McCain's daughter, Meghan McCain, later described as one where he felt like an extension of their own family. Graham's legislative record reflected the same instinct for cross-party deal-making that defined his friendship with McCain. At a time when Washington was growing increasingly polarized, Graham frequently positioned himself as someone willing to negotiate with political opponents if it meant producing actual legislation, rather than simply scoring points. That approach won him admirers, who saw him as a pragmatic governing partner, and plenty of critics within his own party, who viewed his willingness to compromise as something closer to capitulation. Nowhere was that tension clearer than on immigration. Starting in the mid-2000s, Graham teamed up with the late Senator Ted Kennedy, one of the most prominent liberal voices in the Democratic Party, to push a comprehensive immigration reform package. The proposal tried to do several things at once: tighten border security, modernize the legal immigration system, and create a conditional pathway to legal status for undocumented immigrants already living in the country. It generated fierce national debate and drew heavy criticism from conservative activists who argued that any path to legal status amounted to amnesty, no matter how many conditions were attached. Graham pushed back on that framing, arguing that effective immigration policy required balancing enforcement with a workable, compassionate system, two goals he insisted were not mutually exclusive. The issue resurfaced years later when Graham became one of the central Republican figures in the Senate's bipartisan Gang of Eight, a group that spent months in 2013 negotiating a new immigration bill. That legislation included billions of dollars for border security, changes to visa programs, new employment verification rules, and a lengthy pathway to citizenship for qualifying undocumented immigrants. It passed the Senate with bipartisan support, but died in the House of Representatives, never becoming law. Even so, the effort cemented Graham's reputation as one of the more visible Republican voices on immigration reform for the better part of 2 decades. Drawing on his own background as an Air Force lawyer and reserve officer, Graham built a reputation as one of the Senate's most consistent national security hawks. He argued repeatedly that sustained American leadership abroad was essential to global stability, and rather than relying only on briefings in Washington, he made a habit of traveling overseas to see international situations firsthand. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, he made numerous trips to meet with American troops, foreign diplomats, and allied leaders, experiences that regularly informed his public commentary back home. That habit of hands-on engagement didn't fade as those conflicts receded from the headlines. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Graham became one of the loudest congressional voices, supporting continued American assistance to Kyiv, visiting the country multiple times, and meeting directly with Ukrainian officials, including President Volodymyr Zelensky. He consistently framed support for Ukraine, not as an act of charity, but as a strategic investment in broader international security, arguing that a